So welcome, everyone. Glad to see everybody tonight who's joining us live for this third White Too Long author event. I am pleased to have with us tonight, let me get over here, Grace Ji-Soon Kim, who is author of When God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity. This book is not quite out yet, but you can pre-order it. And so it will be available May 7th. Is that right?
May 7th.
May 7th. It'll be out, so you can pre-order it now, and it will be on your porch or available for pickup at your local bookstore on May 7th. So please do that. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you're just coming in, if you want to say hello, just first name and where you're from in the chat, that would be great. So we can see who's in the room. The Q&A is also open. So we're going to take the first 30 minutes or so to have a little conversation between the two of us. And then we're going to open it up for questions. We are in webinar mode tonight, so that means that we won't be able to see everyone, but you can raise your hand if you do the little raise your hand function. If you want to audibly ask a question, I will see that when we get to that part of the night. You can also type a question if you don't want to ask it out loud. You can just type it up, and we'll get to it in the Q&A as well in that second half of the conversation. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest tonight. It is Grace Ji-Soon Kim. She is a professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana. She is the host of I'm going to make sure, is it Madang?
Madang.
Madang, a podcast published in Time, Huffington Post, U.S. Catholic, and The Nation. She is ordained PCUSA minister, and her many books, and I just got the correct count here. This one is number 24, right? So her many books include Invisible, Reimagining Spirit and Healing Our Broken Humanity, and she lives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is actually not too far up the road from me here in DC. So, Grace, welcome tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Robbie, for having me on your Substack. This is so wonderful, and I'm looking at everybody that's coming in from all over US. I think it's all over US. So thank you so much for joining. And I just want to tell everybody that you were on my podcast, Madame.
That's right.
Your New York Times bestselling book, Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. So thank you so much for having me on here.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I thought I'd just start with that amazing number of books that you've written. And I'm always interested in, when you finish a book and you've got, in your case, this mosaic of books kind of out before you, how do you see this one fitting? Like what, you've probably written different kinds of books from different voices, some more historical, some more theological, some more memoir. How does this one fit for you when you kind of stand back and you look at, the body of work that you've done? How do you think about this book?
I'm very happy with this one. And, out of the 24 books, this was actually written the quickest. I usually take years to write it, and so I'm just kind of multitasking and doing things. But this one, I wrote it really out of this desire to kind of put together all the things that I've experienced and trying to make sense of it. So that's why I ended up really writing it quickly, because of what was happening in my own personal life. So I feel it is kind of not wrapping up, because there's more to write about it, but I incorporate a lot of, I wrote a lot of books on pneumatology, so I incorporate that, sexism, racism, I incorporate all of it. So it's kind of like this culmination of all the other previous books that I've written, and I came with this one. It wasn't called When God Became White. I submitted it as Whiteness, because I thought, oh, I'm going to go now with 1 or 2 letter book titles, because it's hard for me to remember. So as you mentioned, I have Invisible, and then the other book that just came out a few weeks ago is this one.
Yes, hold it up. Yeah.
Yeah, survive. Yeah, I'll hold it up. Everyone can look at it. It's Surviving God. So it's just 2 words. So when I submitted this one, it was supposed to be just whiteness. And then the publisher wasn't happy with it. They said, oh, everyone writes about whiteness. We don't know what it means. So they changed it. And I really was very upset with this long title. I said, I can't remember this long title. And then so I said, get rid of the word when at least and just have God became white. And they said, no, no, no. But now I really like this title. I'm so glad I didn't fight and go for whiteness because it is a big kind of topic. So I'm really happy with this title. But thanks for asking me that question. It's something that, all of these other little works that I've done, it kind of comes together here.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that this one is pretty personal. You tell a lot of stories growing up, your story of being an immigrant in both Canada and the US context.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that, and how is that? I mean, you're a theologian, right? So how is that writing both about these very personal experiences growing up in the church and kind of with your theological hat on at the same time?
Yeah, so I feel my other books have been personal, and I feel like maybe there's no more personal part of me to share. But as I write, there's so much more. Like this is actually very personal too, because this is on sexual abuse. So we describe some aspects of our own experiences. But this one, it never was supposed to be a memoir, but I ended up including so much of the immigration story. So, many Koreans at that time, and then after us, it was a Vietnamese, but a lot of young couples with really young children, like age 3 to 7, wanted to leave Korea. It was after the Korean War, and in the 1970s, the economy was still very poor. And so US and Canada were accepting applicants to immigrate. And so it was really the young couple with young kids that immigrated in the 1970s. So my dad's wish was always to come to US, and it was very limited. So he thought, okay, we'll just go to Canada for a bit and then come to the US. But we lived there from 1975, and then I came down in 2004. So I started kindergarten all the way, and I finished my PhD, and then I left 3 years after I graduated with my PhD to start teaching here. So I included a lot of my elementary school experiences of racism because it's still very vivid in my mind. And when I think about it and reflect on it, I sometimes get a visceral effect. Like it was so cruel in the 70s and 80s. I lived in a small white city. It was London, Ontario. And so for them to see a foreigner, kind of someone who doesn't look like them, and they weren't really sure of where Korea was, they thought I was making things up. It was a very painful childhood. So those experiences, and they continue on, racism, and this concept of whiteness, it just continues on. It's not like, oh, Obama became president, so of course now, racism is out the door. It's there, it's systemic. So I wrote this book to kind of share my experience and to kind of reflect on it theologically. And, when I teach, I always tell students theology is biography and biography is theology. We can only come to know God from our personal experiences or our experiences around us. There's really no other way. It's not like I can just encounter God in a book. Well, maybe you can, but anyway, it's through your experience of reading a book or experience of listening to this conversation or your walk today or something at work. That's how you encounter God. So that's why I end up reflecting a lot on my own experiences to understand where God is and who God is. And I bring in my personal stories, and I sometimes include other people, but I don't think I really name. I know some writers name people, and Anne Lamott once said, if you didn't want me to write about you, you should have been a bit kinder. So I'm like, yeah, if you don't want me to write about you, be a little
Yes.
nicer and
A
kinder.
warning to friends of all writers. That's right. Well, let me ask you about, so I'm intrigued by the book because, some of my work has been moving this direction of trying to move beyond thinking about white supremacy as it often is in the US context, in particularly, and I'm from the South of the US, right? So there it is almost always a kind of black, white binary, right? That these conversations, and when everybody says white supremacy, that's what people think about, is this kind of black, white binary. So, and in the Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I tried to kind of bring that out a little more to include Indigenous people in the US and try to think with a broader lens. And you're doing that as well here too. And you write. I was just kind of struck by this kind of very matter-of-fact statement. From the time I immigrated in 1975, white supremacy and whiteness have plagued my life. Is how you wrote it. So maybe you could say a little bit more. What did that look like? Right? What did that feel like? Maybe some like concrete examples or a story or something.
Yeah. So I think in the US context, and I think when I look at the list of people who are saying hello and who are part of this group tonight, many are in the US. I think in the US, as you said, it's a black and white issue. So if you're not African American, then your experiences of racism are not counted, or people think that wasn't racism. So that's what people have said to me from 2004 on when I lived here in the US. Oh, that you're not black, so those are not racist experiences. So people kept saying that to me. And there's a lot of factors that come into play why that is happening. And, one of them is dualism. I think Christianity has fallen into dualism. Just the Western framework, Western philosophy is very, it falls into dualism. So it's black and white, male, female, heaven and earth. It's kind of separated clearly. And if you fall in between, then your stories don't really count. So that has been said to people who are Asian American, Native American, and many Latinx community, that your experiences don't count because it's not racism.
Yeah, I think one time you used the word like AAPI Americans thought of as like honorary whites who don't experience racism or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So I was going to get into that. So
Yeah.
there's other terms like honorary whites. So the whites society has labeled Asian Americans as honorary whites. So we're almost white. So therefore you couldn't experience racism. You're not that dark skinned. So that plays into it. And another concept that plays into it is model minority. So these terms kind of came out in the 1960s by sociologists, and it was to really pit people of color against one another. So if white people keep saying that Asian Americans are model minority, what else they can say is, oh, you African Americans, you have nothing to complain about. If you work just as hard or study just as hard as Asian Americans, then you'll be just as rich. But you see, those narratives are false because we're not all rich. We don't all go into the top schools. Not all of us are employed. If you go to places like Flushing or in LA, where there's a high density of Asian Americans living, they're living in very poor conditions. They may be in these complexes where they shared, like family shared kitchens and bathrooms. That's a type of situation that doesn't get talked about in the kind of like this dominant society. So those kind of narratives, model minority, honorary whites, kind of push our experiences of racism aside. And it almost eliminates all the pain and suffering, oppression, discrimination that Asian Americans have experienced for hundreds of years here in the US. Koreans came, the recent immigration was about 50 years ago. But, if you look at history from the Philippines, from India, from China, many came hundreds of years ago, but still they're always viewed as perpetual foreigners because we don't look white. So there's a lot of things coming into play, and I do discuss some of this in the book and in my previous books.
Well, you're a theologian, so let's talk church for a minute. So you didn't just encounter this out in the city, but you encountered some of this in the
Oh,
ways that it actually seeped into not just church, but even your Korean church. So
yeah.
maybe I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
So, it's not a tremendously long book, but I do cover a lot of topics. So, when God became white, I must say that how we imagine God and view God really affects our behavior, our way of thinking, how people create laws in this American society. You would think it doesn't, but it really does because, um, in the Bible it says, don't make any graven images. God saying, thou shalt not make any graven images of, who I am and etc. But we we tend to put our own image upon God. For example, the last 2,000 years, theologians have been basically all white male European, heterosexual Europeans. And so they kept projecting their own likeness unto God. And you think, how can that be? Well, if you look at any painting, any artwork in Europe, you will see a white male God and a white male Jesus. So Jesus, born in Palestine, and he's a Palestinian Jew, darker skin, olive color, suddenly becomes very white European. And so there's a change even in, how we view Jesus. And so even if we're not supposed to do it, white male theologians have been doing it and they kind of got away with it all this time until you get people like me and feminist theologians and other theologians of color who are questioning this. And when we question it, there's a lot of pushback because, oh, this is who God is. But you see, all these words and images, they're only metaphors and images because none of us have seen God. You and I have not seen God. So we are trying to understand God, and we pick and choose these male, kind of masculine metaphors from the Bible to portray onto God. And there has been tremendous consequences like racism and sexism. So that's why there is, I experience racism, and people of color experience racism today in the church, in the workplace, and in our communities all around us. And so even if I'm sure many people that are here tonight belong to a church or are part of a church or a faith community. You would think that they should be places of welcome, that, everyone's welcome, people of color, all, but it's not in many cases. And that has to do because we continue to talk about a white male God, which then reinforces white supremacy. And so, when you invited me, I was so happy because I think your book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, should kind of be read together with my book. I think
Yeah, it's a good pairing, right?
yeah, I hope people do book clubs, pairing it together, hearing it from a white man, and you do a very good historical research on that book, looking at all what the church has done. And then this becomes a more personal kind of look and tying it together with the concept of, understanding whiteness and how that plays into our theology, our faith practices, and what we do in the church.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about a particular portrait of white Jesus that uh, was up on your living room wall, right over the couch, if I remember right.
Yeah,
And what that was like, I think, as you got older, right? Because when you're a kid, whatever's on the wall is just what's on the wall, right?
yeah.
Because it's just your environment. But like, maybe you could talk a little bit about when you started going, well, wait a minute, like all the stuff that you just rehearsed doesn't quite match, right? What we know from the text and from history. And yet in your Korean immigrant household, there was this white Jesus that had a very prominent place on the wall.
So the picture is, I think many of the people who are here with us tonight will remember it's The Head of Christ by Warner Solomon. And it was a very popular picture. And I remember people made bookmarkers out of them and portraits, and people hung them. And we were very poor immigrants. We didn't have anything. Like, um, nothing in our house was new. Like my father somehow found this broken couch with springs, literally springs coming out, and he brought it home, and then my mother just covered it with a blanket. And we got like this table somewhere. I think it was Goodwill, and then these chairs that didn't even match, and they were like half broken. So that's the kind of life we lived as immigrants. And so I don't know where my father got this picture because I know he didn't pay for it. He gets everything for free. He might have found it in a dumpster. He finds a lot of things in the dumpster and he brings it home. But my mother loved it because she was this kind of this evangelical kind of conservative Christian. And for her, this was like the most important thing in the house. So it was a small little apartment. You walk in, it's a living room, and the couch is right there. So she hung it above our couch. So that was the first thing you saw when you entered our apartment building, and she just loved it. And so, me being a little kid, 5-year-old, I just thought, or I was probably like 7 or 8 at that time. I thought, oh, yeah, this is probably who Jesus is, a white kind of European male. I never questioned it. I never said, oh, is that the true likeness of Jesus? You just accept it. And that was with me. My mother, when we moved, we lived there for like 8, 9 years in this bug-infested apartment building. And when we moved, she like packed it so gingerly, like as if it was gold or something so important. It wasn't real painting. It was just like some print that was in this kind of broken frame. But then once we moved into this new place, she placed it exactly above the couch. Like this was something I idolized too. I just accepted this white Jesus. And when I started seminary, I was chosen to go to India, and I was probably like 20 something, very young. And I saw the same image in India everywhere, like in all the churches. And I said, oh my goodness, this must be the face of Jesus. Like it reinforced to me that how can the same picture be halfway across the world? So it was really reinforced in me. I went to a lot of other white churches, and you practice this white Christianity. So that's really who I thought it was. But now, as a theologian and trying to make sense of racism which kills, racism which hurts, which oppresses, which marginalizes, there's so many consequences to racism. Then you have to unpack this. And that's what I attempt to do in this book, that this picture can no longer be the image of Jesus for me, and I hope for many people as they read this and reflect on who Jesus is and who God is.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you to kind of extend that out just a little bit because you do in the book. What's just say a little bit more about like what's at stake, right? With this image and not just for white churches. I think that's what was I think really powerful about your book is showing like yes, I mean clearly a problem for white Christians and white churches, but it doesn't just operate there, right? It was kind of doing some work even in Korean churches that you were a part of.
Yeah. So, I have a chapter on missiology of whiteness. So, this white God was taken to Asia, to Africa, and South America. So, we have been indoctrinated in this whiteness, that is the standard, that is the true thing in our life. So everyone else, we are horrible people, barbaric, we're uneducated, we can never be as great as white people. So, you buy into it, and the immigrant churches buy into it too. And so it's detrimental. There's a lot of things at stake here. If you're going to continue to embrace a white male God, then sexual abuse. So this book that just
Mhm.
came out deals with sexual violence and sexual abuse. People are going to continue to allow this to happen. Okay, that's what's at stake. Tied in with racism, what happened to the Native Americans here, when 98% were murdered, like under God, in the name of God, that this is okay, that the church had ordained this to happen. That's what's at stake. That is racism. And when enslavement happened here with the Africans, that is racism. This is all whiteness coming in. There's a lot at stake. And if we don't tackle this, we know it's going to continue to happen. And it happens in cycles. And so there's a lot at stake. And we have to stop doing things in the name of God. But if we keep holding on to this white male image, sexual violence, patriarchy, racism, sexism, enslavement, genocide will continue to happen. When I see what's happening in Gaza, Palestinians are darker. And I remember the British Palestinian ambassador in England, on October 8th, he was basically saying, we are not children of a lesser God. We're not, just because we're darker, we're not children of the lesser God. We cannot continue to treat people who are different colored skin, who are not white, and think that they are less valuable because there's a lot at stake. So I'm glad you're asking that.
Thank you
Really
for
dig.
that. I want to ask you about a concept that I know you have expounded on in other works, but I found it in this context so helpful, and maybe you can unpack it a little bit for us. You talk about a theology of visibility toward the end of the book, and you actually have 4 Korean terms that you sort of use to kind of help us understand what that might mean, and kind of how a theology that reorients itself, I think, away from this kind of white male God, uh, kind of touch points it might use to kind of think differently and conceptualize differently.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you just, you put on your teacher hat and, give us a little lesson here, a little
Yeah,
theological
I wish I
lesson.
had a blackboard because these words are a little harder. But anyway, they're very simple words. So the first one is Han, H-A-N. And many theologians, it's not just me, but other theologians have brought that into our theological discourse. And it really, any language, when we're translating from Spanish to English, French to English, Korean to English, it's really hard. But I think the easiest way to translate that is unjust suffering. So, there is suffering. So if I skip a meal, then you get a little hungry. That's a little bit of suffering, but that's not unjust suffering. Maybe you were just busy, or, you forgot to pack your lunch, or you forgot your lunch at home. So that's just a little bit of suffering. But when it's unjust suffering, we're talking about systems that are set up to cause suffering. So systems of racism and sexism, these things cause unjust suffering. And you can experience it individually or collectively. So Korea, we talk about Han. It's a very common word that we use because we as a people have been suffering together. So before, the war had broken out, then we got divided. We're the only divided country in the world at this moment. So we have North Korea, South Korea, that's divided. We were colonized under Japan. We were invaded either by China or Japan or other countries. So collectively, we have experienced tremendous amount of Han. So that helps us kind of make sense for me as a theologian, looking at the other side of sin. We sometimes, in the church, we always talk about, oh, ask God to forgive you. So it's this vertical relationship, and we forget about the horizontal relationship. So the term Han reminds us about the other side of sin, how you are sinning against your neighbor, against your brothers and sisters. So that's the one term, Han. The second one is Chong. So Chong spelled Jeong. It's a concept of kind of love and attachment. So in the English, we use the Greek terms eros, phileo, and what are the other terms? Anyway, love. We have different words. So maybe you can use chong. So chong is this unbreakable love. So you can argue with your friend or your husband or your children, but you come together because of this unbreakable bond between you in your relationships. It's sometimes understood as sticky love. So if you stick your hand in a jar of honey, it gets all sticky and it can't get the honey out. That's the kind of love that Chong is. So that kind of widens your perspective of love. It's almost like in the Bible, God says, nothing can separate me from you, east or west. That's the Chong. So that Chong is helpful in our understanding of everyone around us are brothers and sisters. It doesn't matter what ethnicity they are. So we should be able to share this love between each other. The third concept is Uri. So OU-RI. So Uri means our. So of course we have that in the English language, but the concept is a little different because in the English, the I is the most important. I think, therefore I am. In other communities around the world, I is not that important. The we is way more important. So we don't, I don't say, let's go to my school or my church in Korea. We say, let's go to our church and our school. We don't say, oh, let's go meet my mom or my mother, my mom. We say our mom, even if you're the only child. So if you think like that, this collectiveness, I think that's really helpful in our Christian faith and our faith community, that we are this ourness, this big community, and the individual is not that important. So if there is someone hurting in this community, then we have to do something about it to help. And the last term, the fourth term is chi. I think that's the one that most people here will be familiar with. And it's spelled CHI, or Koreans and Japanese, we sometimes use KI or K apostrophe I, but it means the same. It's chi or ki, and it means spirit. So, we in the Old Testament, we have Ruha. In the New Testament, we have Pneuma. And it all means, wind, breath, life-giving energy. And chi is the same too. And using that term, and I think many people here are probably aware, we use that chi in other words like Tai Chi, Reiki, and it's because it's dealing with the spirit. Taekwondo, we're talking about chi and Taekwondo. Acupuncture, it's about chi. And the chi is moving within us, this life-giving energy. So when someone dies, we say their chi has left them because their body is all cold. Chi keeps us warm. It's this energy. And that's what Ruha is. So I think using chi to understand the spirit of God, you can use Ruha, Pneuma, or spirit, but I think spirit in the English language, because it's so Europeanized and kind of like this philosophical term, it's kind of this nebulous, kind of out there term, while as chi is an embodied understanding of spirit. So if you understand that the spirit of God is within you, and within you and everyone here, then we should be kinder to one another and be more loving and embracing, because God, the Spirit, is already in with each other. In Hawaii, if you go to Hawaii, they greet you aloha. Ha means breath. So spirit is also breath. Chi is breath. Ruha Numa is breath, the breath. And so aloha means sharing the breath of God with you. That's how they're greeting you in Hawaii. That's a native Hawaiians sharing the breath of God with you. I think that's a beautiful way to understand that the God, the Spirit, is in among us and in our midst. So using those four terms would be really helpful in fighting against racism and sexism or any kind of phobia that we experience in this country and beyond.
Yeah, and just say a little bit more about that's beautiful. So thank you for that. But say a little bit more about like how that ties together and what you mean by theology of visibility.
Yeah. Yeah. So it really comes from my previous book called Invisible. I think there's Asian Americans here because they're writing about the Chinese Exclusion Act and other people are writing stuff. And so Asian Americans, our common experience is in being made invisible. So earlier, when you asked me about racism, our racism, people don't count it because we're not Black. So we are made invisible. And it's one thing to want to be invisible, but it's another when you're made invisible. If you're made invisible, then you're not important. Your voice doesn't count. So when we're made invisible, and Asian Americans are just one group. There's a lot of other people, and I'm always hoping that that book becomes a lens for other marginalized groups and other groups of people who are made invisible. there's a problem. Why should one group be made invisible? If we're all, children of God, and if we're all um if we're all important, then we should not be made invisible, and other groups should not be made invisible. Everybody is important. So, using those four terms, I use it to develop this theology of visibility. If you kind of welcome and embrace these four terms and really use it, then you can work towards a theology of visibility. So, trans people or LGBTQ community, everyone is important. Their issues are important. We should be talking about it in our faith communities, in our churches. We have to lift up these issues because everyone is important. Everybody is a child of God. So I'm using those four terms to work towards a theology of visibility. And I do bring it up in this book too, that I'm hoping, as theologians, for me at least, other people are not as creative, but I'm trying to be as creative as I can, and so using my kind of culture and language has been so helpful because we have to understand that God is immense. We're finite beings, so we need all that we can get. African traditional, ways of speaking about God or about spirit are all helpful. And I must say that I've spoken about chi in other contexts, like in Africa, and every time I do, Africans say we have the same concept.
Mm.
So it's nothing new. These are long, thousands of years old kind of concepts that people have used to speak about their experiences and about who God is.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Okay, we're going to open it up here. So we're going to do this two ways. One, if you want to type a question into the Q&A, you could do that. I've got that open, looking at that now. You can also raise your hand, the little raise your hand function in Zoom. If you do that, I think I will see you pop up in the participants list, and if you want to ask a question out loud, you can do that. I can activate there. So do that. We've got a few in the Q&A. I'm going to queue up one of them here while we're seeing if there are others to fill in. So Barbara asked, if God were not given an anthropomorphic image, would we not be dealing with racism? That's one way of thinking about it. And then I want to kind of just add a little Christian twist on that. If we were talking about in a kind of Buddhist context, that'd be interesting, or Hindu context or something like that. But we're talking about a Christian context that does have the figure of Jesus that figures quite prominently, right, in its theology. So that also ties us a little bit, right, to an embodied form. So if you could kind of put that in the mix as you're answering the simple question, that'd be great.
Yeah. So what was the beginning of the question?
If God were not given an anthropomorphic
Oh,
image,
okay.
would we not be dealing with racism? Like, could we have maybe avoid it more if we didn't have these anthropomorphic images of God?
I think that's a possibility. Yeah, we have made, and because of the incarnation. So if you're going to believe in the incarnation, that Jesus is the incarnation of God, and this anthropomorphic understanding of who God is, I think, and then also the gendering of God. The book is dealing with the gendering of God and the racialization of God. So the gendering is we've made God masculine, and racialization, we've made God white. So yeah, I think that has been tied in, and maybe if it wasn't, maybe racism may not have been around, but I'm not sure. I can't answer that, but the fact that God is masculine and male continues to perpetuate it. That I can say for sure, because we continue to worship or talk about a white male God, and that continues to say white people are better and people of color are not. And I must say, as an Asian American, I'm 6% or 6 to 7% of the American population. So, in a way, I've been made minoritized, I've been made marginalized. But if we're going to talk about the global world, we are 60% of the world population. I am the dominant group.
Uh-huh.
So we have to keep things in perspective too of how people become marginalized and minoritized and oppressed. But certainly our image, how we view God continues to oppress women and continues to oppress people of color. So, at the end of the book, I do say we have to embrace these other images of God. And I don't want to give everything away, people have to read the book.
So everyone here is going to buy the book, right?
Okay, yeah, please,
Um,
pre-order.
uh, so I have a question from David that is about you may see in the Q&A here. Which of your books best describes your experiences in childhood and growing up and your transformation into what you are now? And I will say too, I was struck by this, that I mean, you've had a really long journey, right? From immigrant, fairly poor, 1975 in Canada, to a professor of theology today, right? And writing 24 books. So yes, and so this question is like, is there one place where that's captured? Maybe a couple of places where that story is written down.
Yeah, so I think Invisible and When God Became White. I had a copy of Invisible behind me, and then someone wanted a signed copy, so I just mailed it a few days ago. So I don't have any more at home. I have to order more. But it was funny because, well, it's not funny, but when I was writing Invisible, I became really ill. So I think Invisible came out 2022. 2 or 3 years ago, but I became ill just after I submitted it to the publisher. I was really ill and I was hospitalized. Doctors couldn't figure out what was happening. And that was the second episode. Like it happened again a year before. And so people couldn't figure out. So I was really ill. And then I put the book aside because it was already submitted. And then, when you get the copy edits, I got the copy edits and it was like 6 months later. I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe I included all these personal stories.
Mm.
I was shocked, because I haven't read it for a while. And I said, I can't believe I put all these things in. And I said, oh, maybe I should delete it because I was having a panic attack. Maybe I wrote too much of my story in there. Like I put my ordination story, because that one deals a lot with sexism, but it does deal with racism. And I put all that, and it was a painful experience, which it
Mm.
shouldn't have been, but it was. And then I thought, I'm going to start deleting. And then I thought, if I delete one, I'm going to start deleting all of them. And then I just ended up keeping everything. So that has a lot. And once I'm done, it's done. The stories are out there, but then I had to include more stories here. I never in my whole entire life thought I'll ever talk about that image of Jesus hanging in our living room, but it was perfect for this book. And the publisher, they set two cover options. This one, and then the other one had the image of
Mm.
Jesus. And I thought, oh no, everyone's going to think that that whole book is just about that image. So I just decided to go with this one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do think I looked it up once. That image, I think, is possibly the most replicated image of anything in the entire world.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
It was everywhere at one point, and I'm
yeah,
sure it's still hanging in many places, but it was everywhere you turn. Almost every church had it. All the Korean churches had it. And so I just, I just imagine that's how Jesus looked
yeah,
like.
of course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's that
That's all I had.
ubiquitous,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. So Dinah asked, or Dinah, I don't know which it is, but uh, uh, says Theodore Diel, I think, says his book Modern Religion that race and religion are conjoined twins with a mutual genealogy. And the thrust of the question is like, look, if it goes back all the way back, is it the carrier of the gene, and can it even be unraveled? This is a good constructive theological question.
Yeah. So I'm always living with hope. There's a few theologians, but that don't, but I'm one of those that live with hope. So that's why I continue to write. Yes, it may be from right at the beginning of, creation of human beings and the darker skin versus the whiter skin. And you see that kind of being played out in some of the Old Testament passages. So it's been with us for so long, but it gets perpetuated if you continue to worship a white male god, because that's gonna, the legislate like abortion laws, immigration laws, it affects all these laws that lawmakers put into place, because some groups are hated and loved, etc. But I always live with hope. I have one book called Hope in Disarray. And, me and one other theologian, we always kind of have this argument because he doesn't believe we should have hope, because it keeps those oppressed, this false
Mhm.
narrative.
You're
Just
talking about
makes
Miguel de la Torre?
yeah, I didn't want to name him, but anyway. And we've had
Got you.
several. We didn't
Yes.
even we were on a panel at Drew, but it wasn't so much me and him, but I was on that panel. I just let Stacey Floyd Thomas go after him more and other
Yeah.
people. But then we were in Palestine together and we talked about it, because in Palestine, he talked about it again and everybody was so upset because in Palestine, they have to live with hope. And I just, yeah, so that it
Yeah.
was,
I think he's got an article. I listened, there's probably other versions of it, but I think it was called A Theology of Hopelessness, I think was
his
what
book is Theology of Hopelessness.
yes, that's
He
right. Yeah.
begins, like, I think, quoting me, but
Yeah. No,
it's
it's an interesting debate, right? Yeah.
yeah, but for me, I always live with hope. And I think you have to define hope. So for me, in the Bible, it's talking about love, faith, and hope. The greatest of these is, faith, love, and hope. So hope is not this optimism. It's not like, oh, being optimistic, saying, okay, tomorrow racism is going to disappear. Hope is this understanding deep within. It pushes you to work towards justice. It's an anchor within us. And if you're a Christian, this anchor that Christ gives you, that you can then work towards justice. And one of those justices is fighting racism. But Rob, I hate naming all the books, but one of the books that I co-wrote is called Intersectional Theology. In that book, we're saying with Susan Shaw, who I co-wrote, that was our first book, and then I co-wrote with Susan Shaw this one, intersectionality, that all these forms of oppression, racism, sexism, climate injustice, ableism, all these injustices intersect. So they're not these separate silos. They are all intersecting and all intertwining. So racism is tied in with sexism and this environmental racism and economic, social economic status. They're all intersecting. So for me, the hope is, yes, I'm gonna keep writing and fighting racism, which is tied in with sexism and economic status and climate injustice, all of them. So I do live with hope. And I don't know, I hope other people will do it too. And I'm thankful for people who wrote that they're going to pre-order the book.
Oh, good. Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, we have someone who wants to ask a question in person. So I think it's Cherie. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to give you the floor. Here we go. Cherie, if you can unmute. If you're still there.
Some of the
Yeah.
technology is so
Can you
hard.
hear me?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yes, there you are. Good.
Okay. Grace, you're a member of PCUSA, correct?
Yes.
We have quite a few Korean churches. I know I'm in the Syracuse, New York area, and we
Uh-huh.
have a very strong Korean church.
Uh-huh.
Comment on how you think PCUSA is dealing with the Korean churches.
Okay. I'm presently serving as an intern in a white church, a small white church where I live. So I haven't been part of the Korean church for about 10 years or so. So it's really hard for me to comment on how the PCUSA is doing, but we do have the Korean presbyteries, and the Korean churches kind of do their own kind of work. I'm on their email list, but 99% of it's written in Korean, and I don't have the time to sit there and try to read because my Korean, I can speak it very well, but to read it will take a long time. So I'm not up to date, but I know there's a lot of activities going on. So in that way, I think the Korean churches themselves are doing well. I'm part of the Korean American clergywoman, and from there, I don't know how many there are, maybe close to 100, but that might be a wrong estimate. Um, Many of them have always voiced that they want to serve in a Korean American church, but it's almost impossible to. I think within our group, there's only one or two that serve in a Korean American church, and everyone else is in a white church or in a hospital setting or something else. It's really hard for Korean American women to work in a Korean church. So I worked in a Korean church part-time, I'm teaching, so part-time, and it was really, really hard. And I wrote about my ordination experience, which was horrible, in my book, Invisible. It was the point I broke out in hives. Like, it was so horrible that it was like this psychosome. It was an awful experience. And it shouldn't have been. It should have been a joyous experience. I don't know anyone else around me that had had a horrible experience like me, but there was one person that made it unbearable for me. So, and that has to do with patriarchy. So, I think the piece, every church, there's problems. And I think maybe PCUSA has to do more of integration, have more leaders who are Korean American, because there's so many Korean American churches in the PCUSA, be part of the leadership, be a moderator, etc. We've had an Asian American, we had Bruce Ray's Chow, but we need maybe a Korean American, maybe a woman to be in a leadership, and invite Korean American women to speak too. I've been invited more, by the United Methodists and the Baptists than my own Presbyterian. So
Mm.
it's interesting. And like Catholics invite me all the time too. But it's interesting. Thank you so much for your question. And I don't know if I addressed it very carefully.
Yeah, no, that's good. One more here, and then I think we're going to probably let this be the last one. It's a question about how ubiquitous is these images of Jesus in homes still today? Like, do you still see those, going on and in places where you are? And I guess, how does it still play out, I guess, is the other part of that question.
Well, I don't see the image that often, but I'm not looking for it that much anyway. But I think, you see, that image has been with us for so long. Unless you're a child and you've never seen it, it has a big impact. So it's impacted me, and it took me a long time to unpack it. And because my mom adored that picture so much, it was so sacred to her. It took me a long time to unpack it. I wrote all the other books. I never kind of really dealt with this white God until this book. And for me, I should have dealt with it earlier. I think for me, I didn't deal with it because before this book, I see other people who have like embracing the other book. All the other books have dealt a lot with the spirit. I think maybe in the back of my mind, I didn't want to deal with God.
Mm.
So I dealt with the spirit of God. I thought that is a better way for us to engage in dialogue. If you're going to do interfaith dialogue, if you're going to move away from this gendered understanding of God. And it wasn't really until this book I'm really kind of challenging. I think unless we tackle this question of the white male God, I don't think we're going to be able to really tackle the racism and the sexism in our churches. And some churches are doing better than others, but there's a lot of bad, there's a lot of things happening in other churches.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping, some people have gotten pre copies because, like you and some other writers, and they're messaging me. Most of them are people of color, and they're saying they don't know how to bring this topic up in the white church.
Mhm.
So I'm like, I don't know either. But I'm
Well,
hoping people will come up with an idea to do it.
Well, I can say, like, as a white guy who speaks in a lot of white churches, one of the first things I do is look at the stained glass. If I'm in a church that has that tradition of stained glass, and more often than not, it's a very, very white Jesus up on the wall, right? Not tan, not olive, just white, unmistakably white.
Yeah.
And I think that's one place where it still lives, right? Even if those kind of outdated photos, right, don't show up on the wall so much. But I've seen those in predominantly African American churches too. I've seen white Jesus, in those spaces, because it kind of came in through white Christianity, and has kind of colonized those
this
spaces.
whiteness, it's colonial power, and it's really, really hard to deconstruct it and be free from it. It took me a long time. I'm in my midlife right now, and it took me all this time to get to this point. So it's going to take a long time for other people. And so I'm grateful for the listeners that are here that are excited and interested in this topic. So, but I think that's the good news right now, that you know, we need to hear diverse voices, and I'm grateful for your solidarity with people of color like me and with women, because you provided this platform for me, and you do so much great work to fight this. White too long. I think that's what people need to hear. White too long. It has been way too long, and the damage has been great.
Yeah. Well, I'll always thank Brother Baldwin for those words, white too long, which came out of his kind of indictment of the white community following the assassination of Martin Luther King, right? And so he wrote in the New York Times, he said I've kind of in despair, right? He said, I've been convinced that the great majority of the white population of this country is beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. Is how he put it there. And so I think we've had a white God too long, too. One way of kind of summarizing this up.
For sure.
Well, any last words? We're kind of almost at time, but we've got like another minute. Anything you want to leave us with?
Well, I hope people pre-order, and I hope people can use it as a study group in the churches or in other communities. That's really, when I write these books, that's my hope, and that it'll be helpful for many people, people of color and the white community, because this is dialogue that we need to have. It's an important dialogue. So I'm just grateful that I finished this book.
Well,
When
it's
you
a
start
gift.
book.
And I'll kind of put it back up here. It is available in 2 weeks, but available for pre-order right now. It'll show up in 2 weeks. When God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity. And there's, 23 others you can order as well.
Well, one of them that came out last year is very expensive. It's called Christianity in North America. It's an encyclopedia. That's $200. So you can skip that one and get all the other cheaper ones.
Yeah, but this one I will say it's accessible, it's personal. It would make a great like small group reading thing.
It's
so
not
I really recommend
writing.
Yeah, for that. All right. Well, thank you so much for the gift of this book and for your ongoing work and for being with us tonight.
And I think people should read it with your book.
I'd second that. No, that goes
I
really
think
well.
those two books need to come together. And because I had you on, and then I wrote this one, or I forget the timeline, but I think your book was impactful to me, and Lisa Sharon Harper's Fortune. I select these authors that I want to read and use in my own research. So I'm just grateful for your books too. So
thank you. Yeah, likewise. And this has been the White Too Long Author Forum number 3. We'll have more to come for everyone, but thank you so much for joining us tonight, Grace.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming in.